prior to Christ's crucifixion. All right, so here's the thing. You also had Paul, when he did finished his third missionary tour, and he showed up in Jerusalem to meet with James, and he received a warm reception. Mm-hmm. Yet there was a large group of people who were aware that he had shown up, and he was very controversial at this point. And so James, again, told him to go and take 4 new recruits and go through the purification process. Now, how was that any different than when he was reprimanding Peter? Because if he goes through the purification process, paying for the purification, the priests and the temples to do all that process, after Christ had died already, there should be no need for purification whatsoever. Now the question is this: would that not be like taking off your wedding ring after having married Christ? You are now taking your wedding ring off just for the appeasement of the perceivers. That's my question to you.
So let me ask this question. Not going to deflect at all, because the question I'm asking is part of the answer or my reply, which could be flawed. I will say at the outset. My understanding is this: we understand that we are saved by grace, and we understand that grace imparts something to us that was very significant, that was not had for anybody that was under the law, and that was liberty. Now, the big issue is this: is what we're saying, or if what you're saying is that Paul was doing was the same thing as what Peter is doing. The issue becomes, was Paul doing it and saying that this is somehow a means to salvation? Now, here's the thing: just like here, it wasn't a sin to be circumcised. But what was happening here, well, 2 things were happening here. One was was circumcision, because they were trying to compel Titus to be circumcised. And Paul says, we're not having that, because you're making that circumcision the grounds as of his salvation being attached to the gospel. Now, when it comes to what's going on in Galatians 2:11 through 14 between Paul and Peter, that what Peter was doing was basically a hypocritical act, where there was the Judaizers along with the people who, like Peter, are supposed to have understood God's grace, and they were compelling them. But Paul was dealing with people who were like-minded, that wasn't, and this is where I may have a flawed response, if not all of it. But anyway, I'm just giving you my understanding of it. But the issue is what Paul was doing, was it being part of what was being used to convey to others that they were necessary for salvation? And that's my Greg, go ahead and answer that, or speak to it.
Yeah, I would just also point out, what Peter did was in the context of a Christian assembly.
Yes.
Right? It's in an assembly of believers. Whereas what Paul's doing, going through the purification and all that, that's not in the context of a Christian assembly. And maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding is that's to gain access to unbelievers in the temple. You see what I mean? So I think the context is different too. And as you pointed out, it's not that circumcision is forbidden. Sabbath keeping isn't forbidden in the New Testament, New Covenant, right? Nor would be, the Nazirite vows or anything like that. None of those things are forbidden. But yeah, I think the main difference is what Peter did was in in the context of an assembly of believers, whereas what Paul was doing later was not in that same context.
And I think that Paul also, and I believe it was Paul who said that he would be all things to all people in order that he might win some to Christ. And so I don't see where Paul fell there. Um, and I certainly don't see that being the same as even if he did fall into error there, I still would not compare that to what's happening between Peter and Paul in Galatians 2:11. What do you think, DT?
I think. Hold on.
Yes, I'm sorry.
No
Well, the
problem.
purpose is to be controversial, so
Yeah.
I'm giving something to throw around. We know that the causation was provided
Right.
by
Right.
James, and the causation was, hey, you have a lot of people who are zealous, and they've been told that you are against Moses.
Right.
So that's the premise. So we
Right.
already know that's the premise. So as a result, you do have Paul following his instructions to do so.
Right. Right.
Now, the problem with this is the purification. We understand they're sacrificing or they're giving some type of tribute in that process, and you're paying the priest to actually go through that process. But Christ, having already paid the final all be all payment, the true payment, which all those things were just symbolic to represent, it does now cause a conflict as far as, are you doing this, and the fact that you're doing it when we take on that cross, when we have that substitution, that, in Paul's words, as he had said, it's almost like an insult. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter what the reasons are. We do see that there was a falling out. He did get arrested at that particular point in time when he was, in fact, doing it. And that's what led to the first arrest. People argue whether or not that was the first or the second, but I believe he had that first arrest, and then he got released right before, I believe he wrote, I want to say Titus, and then he got arrested a second time. And the second time, that's when Nero pretty much did him in.
So would you say?
But-
Would you say that Paul? Here's the question. The question is going to be this: was Paul sinning, or was Paul exercising his Christian liberty? And then I'll go to you, Meg, after that. What would you say, DT? Was he sinning, or was he exercising Christian liberty? Because it seems to me that when we talk about liberty, liberty is expressive of Christians being able to conduct themselves in certain ways, in certain circumstances that might have been deemed sinful in other circumstances before the gospel of grace came around. For instance, if like I have some family members who are Seventh-day Adventists, they do things like, well, they do things like this. Now, what do I do when I get invited to their situations, or when I go there and they don't eat meat, or I go to if they invite me to one of their church events, do I go? So the issue comes down to how you view, and this may be a good topic to have at some point. What is involved with Christian liberty? But what I want to ask you, DT, because I definitely want to look this up and talk about this with you again. But I want to ask you this question first before we move on. Do you think Paul was sinning, or do you believe he was exercising Christian liberty?
All right, that's a fair question. If I had an agenda, if my purpose is to defend Paul's actions, I would say he was using liberty. If I'm looking at it objectively and recognizing that all of the apostles are human, and all of the apostles make mistakes as described all throughout the Bible, only Christ is our example. I have no problem with saying that that was something that was wrong to have done, and as a result, it was consequential. I look at Peter. Peter was the one who was in error initially.
Right.
Paul reprimanded him. I see the same act. Of course, you show different circumstances behind it. That's true. But we also see that Paul's entire career was spent saying that you should not get circumcised. You should not be doing these certain things. You should not be sacrificing animals. They were all symbolic and they were shadows. We have Christ. So when I look at that and we realize that it was, again, James' company and it was coming from that source, we kind of can see what's going on behind it. James was the main pillar of the church. It wasn't Peter, it was James. Right. Correct. So when we see them going back to Jerusalem, then again we have that influence. When I look at Paul, we know that the Holy Spirit is what does what. Right. But when we look at Stephen had no concern about playing chess. He simply says, look, you guys are this and that and this, and I'm ready to go now. But when you have Paul, he's a tactician. Right. Paul will say things like, is it legal to be punishing a Roman citizen like this? Oh, yeah, I happen to be one. And he gets out of that situation. And he does it again. Well, you know what? I'm appealing to Caesar because I don't want to go to,
Right.
So we have distinctions.
You made me think of something else. DT, you made me think of something else, and I'll go to you, Meg. I haven't forgotten about you. Because a good example is what you actually brought up, which triggered my thoughts about when you talked about eating meat, for instance. Because it was Paul who said, and I think this is consistent with what Greg was saying about the context, being in that body of those believers, and that mixed body of people where there was confusion as to the what grace allows or should not allow, meaning that should we add the law to it or some aspects of the law to it, or is it standalone? This is what Paul was battling with, the purity of grace. But let's talk about food for a second. It was Paul who said that if you go to somebody's feast, you eat whatever is served. You eat whatever is served. And you do so with thanksgiving. But if somebody tells you that this food, that this meat was sacrificed to an idol, then you don't eat it. But you don't pull back from eating the meat because there's a problem with the meat itself. You pull back because of how it affects the conscience of the person who tells you that the meat was sacrificed to idols. You see? And so I think that this is along the lines of what was going on with Paul and the purifications. So, I do think, and like I said, I will concede, to the possibility of being in error here, because I do want to look into this more. But from where I'm sitting, shooting from the hip, from memory, I see it in that same vein as the direction that he gave about the meats. It's like, it's not about the meat. It's about the conscience of those who are witnessing what you do when they hear that this is where it came from. So in the same situation that with dealing with Titus and the Judaizers, it's like, wait a minute, you're saying that circumcision is part of the salvific process. So if you say that, then I can't allow my disciple to be baptized because it's going to send the wrong message and it's going to affect the conscience in a way that is contrary to the truth and contrary to the gospel. But if Titus wants to get circumcised, maybe just for cleanliness reasons, I won't withhold him for that. But if he's doing it because his conscience has been affected by those who say you must do this in order for your grace to be validated, that's a different story. So what I'm hoping that I find out when I look at what you bring up, DT, I'm hoping that what I find out is consistent with what I'm saying. So I won't say that I'm right or wrong on this one at this point. But what I will say is that is shooting from the hip without giving time to it. This is kind of where my leaning is, because I think that Paul had a good grasp of law and grace, and I would say above anyone in the scripture outside of Christ. But we'll see. We'll see. Great question. I'm glad you brought it up, and I think it's useful because maybe other people will look into it as well, and they'll be provoked and persuaded in that way to check it out. Meg, go ahead.
My my wheels are over here spinning from that question. Okay, but I want to go back to something that you said in 1 Corinthians 19 through 23, and I think this is where we see this unravel. And the reason why is because here we see like Paul is like, he's explaining his missionary strategy, right? So he was humbling himself and adapting his behavior without compromising the gospel or God's law so that more people would believe, right? But he said in the very beginning, he said, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win the more." Okay. So let's go a little bit deeper with this.
Okay.
So we see that Paul is voluntarily becoming a servant, right? Lowering himself to meet people where they are to win the more, so people can get salvation, right? So when he says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew," so when he was among the Jews, he respects Jewish customs, circumcision, dietary laws, whatever, so as not to offend and to gain the hearing of the gospel, right? But to those who were under the law, it refers to those who were strictly keeping Moses' law, whether they were Jews or proselytes. He identifies with their position to reach them. So it doesn't mean that necessarily he's compromising the truth, but then it goes on to say to those without the law. So those were the Gentiles, right? So when he was among the Gentiles who don't observe the law of Moses, he's not imposing Jewish customs, yet he still lives under Christ's moral law. So we see that he does not sin or become lawless. He remains obedient to Christ, right? So what I can say, I guess, is what it does not mean is that he's compromising the truth of the gospel. He's not participating in sin or disobedience, and he's not being hypocritical or two-faced. He's literally laying out his mission plan, how he's going to act. But if we really look at it a little bit deeper, what he's doing then is becoming exactly as Christ was. Right? He who knew no sin, right? He didn't know sin, but he was willing to lay down his personal preferences for the sake of others hearing the gospel. So he was inadvertently also communicating the message in ways to make sense to the people that he was around. So, yeah. So, I think you went by that too fast, but I think, and then when you swifted by it, I said, light bulb, bing, and then I looked into it.
My thing is I want to stick to the program, but I did want to address it. I don't like, I'm not one to run from a question. And I know DT is a smart person. So when he asks a question, there are certain people that when they ask you something, you really want to check it out and make sure you're not messing things up. So, there's certain people that when they ask you a question, you're like, you're almost a little afraid at first. Like,
have you ever been on DT's live when he puts people in the hot seat? Have you seen his situational stuff that he does?
I've been in there a couple times. I've watched
it's
a couple
good.
times.
It's fun, actually.
Yeah. I've been in there. I've been on the live without being actually in it many times. But,
I haven't seen him do them recently, but it is fun.
Right. Well, that's what I mean. There are certain people that yourself, Greg, DT. There's a lot of good people that I know that if they say something or ask something that challenges me, I know it's not going to be something that's just a haphazard question that they're just throwing out there to be right about something or wrong about something. I just know that it's something I should probably look at more thoroughly before I give a firm dogmatic commitment on my response to it. But you're right. I think that I'm going in the right direction with the question that he answered or that he was asking. So I'm comfortable with that. And I think that's going to be the outcome of the whole situation. I mean, even Christ was told that, like the Bible tells us that John the Baptist, Jesus himself was accused of being a drunkard and a wine bibbler. A wine bibbler and a glutton. And sometimes I wonder, how did they come to that conclusion? But they found things that were wrong with, and I think it's mainly because Christ was around people, the average person. He wasn't like saying, I can't be around these people. So he went to the wedding feast and he went to all these different places. He didn't avoid being in the company. Christ was comfortable around sinners. And thank the Lord that he was. Because none of us would be here having this conversation if he wasn't the Son of God in human flesh. He was the Lord of glory, and he chose to hang around and around sinners, and he had nothing but thunderbolts for those who were righteous in their own eyes. So that's why it's important for us to really learn his word and to get into what his mind is, which is what we do. So now we deal with this issue that DT was talking about Peter. So in verse 11 of Galatians 2, Paul says, but when Peter came to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. Paul had an issue that was of such a degree that he would confront Peter to his face, is the way he says it. And he says, for before that, certain men who came from James' disciples, and as DT said, James was the real pillar of the apostles. He was top dog. And it says, but his disciples came and they were eating with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. So in other words, Peter is sitting at the table eating with the Gentiles. No doubt, whatever they were eating probably would not have been considered kosher, or whatever that equivalent was back then. Or it could have just been the fact that he was just eating with the Gentiles, period. But no doubt, I believe it was a combination of the two. Otherwise, there would have been, I feel that it wouldn't have been much of a reason to bring up that he was eating with them. But the thing is, it did say he was eating with them. So it's not clear if it was about the food or if it was about the company or if it was both. I lean to the idea that it's both. It's safer. It makes more sense. So Peter's sitting down there eating with the Gentiles. Now, James being a pillar in the church, his disciples, they come over here to where Peter is eating with the Gentiles. And it says that Peter, fearing them, verse 12, fearing them which were of the circumcision, meaning the Jews, the Judaizers, it says, and other Jews, Peter dissembled likewise with them, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. So you can see why Paul is really not happy. Paul is not having it. So here's the situation. Paul comes there with Barnabas. That's his disciple. Peter is sitting down having Kentucky Fried Chicken or whatever it is he's having with the Gentiles. The disciples of James come, and the Judaizers, the guys that are trying to convince people to be circumcised and whatever else, they come. And because Peter knows these are James's disciples, he believes he's on the wrong side of whatever issue that he had in his mind, which it didn't seem to be that anybody was conveying anything. But it says that Paul says that, listen, it was other Jews along with Peter, supposed to be believing people who were trying to aid and instruct these Gentiles. But what we see here, it says that these other Jews and Peter, They all got up and left out of fear. You would think that what Peter went through the night that Christ was being taken to be crucified, that Peter would be above all these things. But we find out he's still just a man. He's fearing these other men. So he gets up. And now when he gets up, people that are with him, they get up too because they think that's the right thing to do. And what do? They leave these Gentiles that they had been witnessing with, sharing with, pontificating over. Now they get up and they leave. And then Paul sees that it was such a powerful moment, an overwhelming moment, that even Barnabas himself was affected. So he also, Paul says in verse 13, got carried away with their dissimulation. So now you have Paul sitting here with the Gentiles, and he's a little peeved over what's going on. And then Paul says in verse 14, but when I saw that they walked not uprightly, according to the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, if you, being a Jew, live after the manner of the Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why do you compel the Gentiles to live as the Jews? Sister Mariah, it's my first question for you tonight, sister. Glad you made it. What is Paul saying? Why is he upset? What is verse 14 all about?
It's more so that he's being a hypocrite.
Okay.
It's what I see. That he's encouraging them and eating and fellowshipping with them, but he is still tied to the old ways of the law. And I think that influences him to go back to his old ways more so. When he sees them, it reminds him of that. He jumps up and goes back, not wanting to have that friction. Or I know that Peter struggled a lot of the times from like the transition from law to grace. And he kind of was mixing the two together. And that caused confusion, like should they be put a yoke upon their necks and bear something that they couldn't even keep and do themselves?
Right. Absolutely. Sister Lisa, what do you think?
I agree with Mariah. He was sitting there. Paul says earlier they didn't have anything to say to him when he was preaching, that no one had to be circumcised. And then suddenly, when the big dogs come, it was all down the tubes, it seemed like.
Right.
So
Let me ask, Brother Salvation, let me ask you a question. This is gonna be on the more on the practical side, because I know you are a heavy brother.
No.
But let me ask you something on the practical side.
Yes.
If you can, if you're willing, give us an example of how something like this happens today.
Okay. From what I gathered happened to Peter on the rooftop in the vision with the sheet knitted at the four corners, the Spirit told him, call that not common or clean, that which the Lord hath cleansed. So if Peter were today, he would go back among the Hasidim and live as them, and then come back with us and eat with the Gentiles. And as soon as some Hasidim Jews come over, he'd get up from the table. I would have to hold his hand and say to him, you don't believe what you're doing is right? Who is your judge? Them or the Lord? Because we're told whatsoever is not of faith is sin.
Right.
But he also was not dressed properly when the Lord showed up on the beach shore.
Right.
It was Andrew told him, "It is the Lord." Then he grabs his fisher's coat and throws himself into the ocean to cover himself.
Right.
So I think it's a mistake to go back and look at the religious folks or your, you did in the Navy, I think, yes?
Yes.
Whenever servicemen dock shore or come aboard shorelines, they get what they call a furlough, a certain amount of days of liberty, and they're free to do certain things, but they can't defect. But what Peter was doing was almost a defection from the truth, and I think that's what enraged Paul, and he had to say, put that in the root, cut it in the root.
Absolutely,
If
brother.
he goes among the Hasidim, the law, then say, wait a minute, are you of faith by grace, or do you now believe in the works of the law?
Right.
Are you now calling that your congregation? You can't deny Christ again, can you, Peter?
Right. So, banana pancakes, you there, sister?
Yes, what Brother Salvation just said reminded me also when Mary broke her vase of expensive oil, and then the religious people at the table were like, "Oh no, a woman's not supposed to do this," and
Right. I know what you mean. Let me ask you a question.
yes,
If you were one of the Gentiles sitting at that table that Peter and the other Jewish folks there that were there sitting down having dinner with them and conversing with them and fellowshipping with them, if you were one of those Jewish people, and not Jewish people, Gentile people, what do you think you would have felt like? What do you think you would have felt like witnessing that, what Peter did and those other folks that were with him? When they saw James come, what do you think you would feel like? What do you think that those Gentiles felt like?
yeah, like here come these people. Nowadays we know them as legalists, like that will have me jump through loophole after loophole to try to earn my spot as a believer, a true believer.
Right? Meg, what do you think? What do you think those Gentiles thought?
They were told the new gospel. I mean, they were told the new gospel. They were living off of what Paul was preaching versus
No. They were sitting with Peter.
Oh yeah, they were sitting with Peter. So that's what I'm saying. You would have to use like a new scenario, just like you said, to answer the question. It's like let's say that
If you were one of the Gentiles sitting at that table with Peter, and
I would be confused.
And why would you be confused? Confused about what?
I would be confused because Peter came from the law, right? He himself, I feel, was coming out of that to truly understand. But then you have Paul over here saying you're free from the law, but then Peter's been around. Paul just came on the scene, and you're like, oh my goodness, who do I believe, Peter or Paul? Right. And so I would have been confused. But here's a scenario though. This is a good one I was thinking about. So if a pastor is known for like welcoming people, welcoming everyone in the church, right? He eats lunch with the members from all walks of life, including new believers.